Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight for Watergate at 50, the burglary that changed the nation. It has been called the scandal that never goes away, and with good reason. 50 years after the break-in at the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel, we still do not know the full story of how the burglary came to happen. What we do know is that the events that followed, culminating in President Nixon's resignation in August 1974, continue to hold lessons about the nature of power that seem to resonate even more strongly as the years go by. So tonight we're going to learn the story of how a local break-in became a national scandal and how it profoundly changed the way Americans think about their political institutions. And this presentation is led by Dan Breen, who's a senior lecturer in legal studies at Brandeis University and a recipient of the Louis Brandeis Award for excellence in teaching. While his primary academic interests lay in the law and politics of the early republic, he also holds a Ph.D. in American history and enjoys lecturing on a wide variety of subjects. So all 70 of us that are watching live here on Zoom, and the hundreds that will watch on demand, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Dan for joining us here tonight. And Dan, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you very much. And welcome to all of you, all points of the compass, as we talk about the Watergate scandal this evening. As I begin, I did want to point out before I forget that if you'd really like to learn more about the Watergate scandal in all its many facets, a really good way to do that is to read maybe, I think, the most recent very good book on Watergate by the author Garrett Graff, Graff, who has done a wonderful job of researching the scandal and its aftermath. Maybe you can find it at your local library or bookstore, but if you want to learn more, Garrett Graff's Watergate, to me, is probably the place to go. So let's begin with a few words about Watergate as I share my screen, always the most difficult part of any presenter's ordeal in a presentation like this. So we'll go to the slideshow from the beginning, and we can begin at the beginning with, as you can see on the screen, episode 1. So the idea I have is to tell the story of Watergate in a way that I think may make it comprehensible a bit more easily by telling the story in regard to 6 separate episodes that made the scandal what it was, and especially ensure that this thing wasn't going to be just a minor event. In fact, it was going to bring down the Nixon administration. And if we have a time, maybe we'll get to episode number 7. But I thought a fun way to begin would be to note that ever since Watergate, which only captured the national consciousness in the middle of 1972, just about every major scandal is going to have that suffix gate after it, not just in the United States, but all around the world. And in fact, if you live in Azerbaijan, you might know about Gate, in which case you'd have an advantage over me. I don't know what that was, but that's an example of a scandal with gate at the very end. But I think my favorite of the international gates is something called Gate, which had to do with an event in London when a minor MP was denied entrance to the main entryway at 10 Downing Street. This person had to go through a separate gateway. They did not much like it. And so the scandal became known as Gate. And it's all, of course, attributable to the vast importance that Watergate has and continues to have in the national and even the international consciousness. So let's tell the story of Watergate in what I consider to be probably the 6 most important episodes of that story. And we begin with the inauguration of Richard Nixon, as you can see here, in January of 1969. The thing about Nixon, among many things about Nixon, was that he hated every little bit of evidence of the prior 2 Democratic administrations at the White House. He didn't like to be reminded of Johnson and Kennedy. And so, among other things, when he got to the White House, if there was a picture of Johnson or Kennedy on the desks of one of the secretaries there, he would immediately order it removed. Just didn't want anything to do with his prior presidents in the White House. And among other things, he found out upon entering the Oval Office in the early days of administration that Lyndon Johnson had a taping system there, which wasn't unusual. Other presidents had taping systems as well. But that was a reminder of Lyndon Johnson. So Nixon right away ordered that taping system removed, just ripped out of the White House, the Oval Office, so there was no remnants of it. And there was no taping system at the White House in 1969 and 1970 and into 1971. But what happened to change that was Nixon began to be very frustrated about, among other things, his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger. What Nixon came to realize, especially by 1971, was that Kissinger would be very tough in regard to matters like Vietnam when Kissinger was actually in the White House talking to Nixon, and he'd talk tough like a real hawk. But then Nixon found out that when Kissinger would go around Washington and talk to all his friends, some of them from his progressive days at Harvard, Kissinger would act as if he was the lone dove in the White House, always restraining that so-called madman Nixon, just to make him look good among his old friends, among some of the progressives, at least in Washington. And Nixon didn't like that. He wanted a way to set the record straight. He wanted people to know someday just what Kissinger and others were actually like in the White House, just in case their memoirs would differ from Nixon's eventual memoirs. And the only way to do that we'd have a way that it would be unquestionable what somebody actually said, and that meant a taping system. And so in the spring of 1971, late winter, early spring, Nixon told H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff, that it would be a good idea to have a taping system. And the question was, how would that be installed? Well, it turned out that the chief of staff, Haldeman, had a man who was actually very good at getting things done, among other things, presiding over the installation of a taping system. And that man was this man here, Colonel Alexander Butterfield, a man who had flown 98 combat missions over Vietnam, a very efficient person indeed, who Haldeman really trusted. And it was Butterfield's mission now to have the taping system installed at the White House. Among Butterfield's accomplishments was the fact that when he was at UCLA, back in his college days, he was actually named the most collegiate looking male. Make of that what you will, but that was one of his honors. And in 1971, Butterfield got to work installing this taping system. And eventually, a taping system was installed, not just in the Oval Office, but also at Camp David and also at the Executive Office building, where Nixon, like many presidents, had his own office where he could go when he liked. So there are at least 3 separate places where there was a taping system. And the virtue of this taping system, which hardly anybody knew about, was that as soon as you opened your mouth anywhere this taping system was, the taping system was activated. You didn't have to turn it off and on. One reason it was that way was that Nixon didn't really trust himself to turn it off and on. He was a bit of a technological klutz. And so the taping system would just go on as soon as somebody said something. So that happened in early 71. And the next event, not long after that, episode number 2, was the Pentagon Papers, which were published ultimately by the New York Times, later by the Washington Post and the Boston Globe. And what those papers revealed, of course, were years of official lies about the Vietnam War, much of which, of course, the public didn't know. The Pentagon Papers had been compiled by this man here on the left, Daniel Ellsberg, laboriously copying page after page after page on that primitive Xerox machine he had access to at the Rand Corporation, because Ellsberg felt the public had the right to know the story of Vietnam. And as of 1971, the public did indeed know, courtesy of Daniel Ellsberg. Well, why should that bother Nixon? Because everything in the Pentagon Papers had to do with Democratic administrations, especially Kennedy, but also Lyndon Johnson. If anybody looked bad, it was them because of these revelations in the Pentagon Papers. But that's not the way Nixon thought about it. He felt that Daniel Ellsberg, and maybe those around him, might actually be in league with people at the White House who might perhaps leak confidential information as a way to make Nixon and those around him look bad. If Ellsberg could come up with this information, what else did he have access to? Who at the White House may be talking to Ellsberg, and maybe those who sympathized with Ellsberg? And Nixon wanted a way to make sure that information didn't leak from the White House. So here's what he said to Bob Haldeman, his chief of staff. You can't drop this, Bob. You can't let that Jew steal this stuff and get away with it. Technically, Daniel Ellsberg was a Christian Scientist, but that was the kind of nuance that was lost on Nixon. Well, how were they to make sure that people weren't leaking things to the White House as important, perhaps, as something like the Pentagon Papers were? And the only thing that those around Nixon could think of was to have a special crew identified, named, and perhaps given an office at the executive office building who would be in the business of, if necessary, tapping phones. And while they were at it, perhaps making Ellsberg look so bad that maybe the public would lose confidence in him. And the job of putting such a team together was divided up between this man on the left, that's John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, and this man here as well, Nixon's counsel, Chuck Colson. And they were now given this responsibility, find a way to make sure that there weren't leaks from the White House. People from the CIA were recruited to be a part of this team, including a man named E. Howard Hunt, former CIA operative, later a spy novelist. And also, even more famously, this man here, that's G. Gordon Liddy, former prosecutor, lawyer, former member of the FBI, agent for the FBI. All of them had some surveillance experience, and Colson and those around them began to put this team together. One of the people responsible for assembling all of them was a man named Bud Crow, who would later turn up in a lot of incidents in Watergate. But Liddy was one of the most popular, if not the most popular, I shouldn't say that, but one of the most well-known of these new unit members that would work out of the White House in the executive office building. Liddy liked to go around the White House and regale secretaries there with tales about how, if he wanted to, it was actually possible for him to kill somebody with a pencil, kind of the character Liddy was. My favorite story about him was that when he was a prosecutor in Dutchess County, New York, he presided over the arrest of the people who would eventually be Steely Dan. They were going to school at Bard College at the time, and they ran afoul of G. Gordon Liddy. Others did as well when he was a prosecutor. But the question was, what were we going to call these people, this new unit, rather secretive unit that would work out of the White House? And among those who were involved in making sure this team would congeal and be an actual series of trustworthy operatives was a guy working for Henry Kissinger, and his name was David Young. And when David Young's grandmother asked him, well, what are you doing for the White House? What are you doing in your job there? David Young answered, well, I'm helping to plug leaks. And the grandmother said, oh, that must mean you're a plumber. And so the secretive unit, including E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, became known as the Plumbers ever after, as of the spring of 1971, spring and summer of 1971. And among other things, they really wanted to make Daniel Ellsberg look bad. So one of the schemes that Colson had in mind, that some of the plumbers considered, was to somehow get a hold of Ellsberg, dose him with LSD, so he would go around making a fool of himself by crazy statements, as if he were would be high on LSD. Luckily, they never did that. Something else that Nixon thought might be a good idea, Colson did too, was to break into the Brookings Institution, a progressive institution, a think tank in Washington, D.C. And one way they could do that, perhaps, was to set off a bomb at the Brookings Institution, blow a bunch of stuff up, creating a diversion so some of the plumbers could get in there and look around and see what kind of intelligence they could find. Thankfully, that didn't happen. But one thing that did happen, as many of you know, was the plumbers did break into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office with a view towards trying to find things that might make Ellsberg look a little untrustworthy, look bad. All of that, of course, illegal. But we do have, as of 1971, this plumbers unit founded in the White House. And there was no doubt that Nixon was a secretive personality, so part of this shouldn't be surprising. But there's always been a controversy about what Nixon was so afraid of anybody finding out. What was he so afraid of? Why did he want any possible leak, any possible contact between the White House and the press investigated and discovered? And perhaps there's no actual answer to that question. It could just be Nixon's personality. But there's one theory that's long been floated, that Nixon was worried about one particular thing, especially in 1971, as the election year of 1972 approached. And that was that maybe somebody would find out about allegations that back in 1968, in the heat of the presidential campaign, Nixon had done something that maybe the public wouldn't much like if they ever found out about it. And the story goes, and there's some people who believe this very thoroughly, although it's never been demonstrably proven. The story goes that towards October of 1968, with Nixon and Humphrey in a virtual dead heat in that presidential election, Lyndon Johnson and the North Vietnamese may have been on the verge of agreeing to hold serious talks, perhaps leading to a truce in the Vietnam War in return for Johnson's agreement to order a bombing halt of North Vietnam. And if that were to be true, and if that were to be public, then that would help Humphrey's chances, Johnson's vice president, to win the White House in 1968. And if Nixon got wind of that, what he might have done, according to some accounts, was contact this woman here in the middle. That's Anna Chennault, the wife of World War II hero Flying Tiger Claire Chennault, who had contacts with the South Vietnamese government. And it could be that Anna Chennault was instructed by the people around Nixon to go to the South Vietnamese leadership and tell them that if they scuttled this potential truce, this potential deal, then Nixon would promise them, the South Vietnamese, that he would deliver a better deal for them should he become president in the end of the war be at hand. We do know that the deal was scuttled, nothing much came of it, and that certainly worked to Nixon's benefit in 1968. Did Nixon do this? If so, then he would not want that to be well known, as mendacious as that was, sacrificing the national interest for his own prospects in 1968. Was that what he wanted to keep secret? Well, perhaps we'll never know. But we do know that the plumbers were formed by 71, a unit that, at least in the Ellsberg case, with the break-in at the psychiatrist's office, certainly did break the law and were certainly planning other law-breaking activities as well. And that brings us finally to episode number 3. We are now into 1972. There's a taping system at the White House that hardly anybody knows about. There's also a plumbers unit at the White House operating out of our Office 16, actually, at the Executive Office Building that hardly anybody knows about. And that brings us to 1972, the beginning of the year, as Nixon began to plan his run for re-election. It happened that in January of 1972, the decision was made to assign various members of the plumbers to the committee to re-elect the president, headed by that man on the left, John Mitchell. The committee to re-elect the president could have been called the committee to re-elect Nixon, but they had a focus group that decided that the focus group liked the name committee to re-elect the president more than committee to re-elect Nixon, so it became known as the CRP, or sometimes as CREEP, which is probably how I'll refer to it tonight. In January of 1972, G. Gordon Liddy and other plumbers were assigned to work for CREEP in whatever perhaps shenanigans they might dream up to make Democrats look bad in the 1972 campaign. With that as a view, there was a famous meeting in 1972 between Mitchell on the left and John Dean, White House counsel John Dean, who you see on the right, with Liddy. And the point of that meeting was to try to find out what Liddy could offer in the way of helping CREEP win the election of 1972. And it turned out that Liddy had all sorts of ideas grouped together in what he called Project Gemstone. By the way, Liddy never wanted this unit to be known as the plumbers. He liked the idea of calling them Odessa after the allegedly secret group of former Nazis operating in places like South America after World War II. That was never given them as the name. They always were known as the plumbers. But Liddy, a very secretive character himself, now had some very public ideas about how to make Democrats look very bad. So he outlined these ideas, Project Gemstone, in front of Mitchell and Dean. Among the ideas he had were to kidnap people who were likely to protest at the Republican National Convention, spirit them to Mexico after drugging them, leaving there during the Republican convention, and only bringing them back maybe after it was over. Another idea he had was to hire a houseboat at the time of the Democratic National Convention in Miami, lure Democratic delegates to the houseboat where there would be prostitutes so that the Democrats could be photographed in compromising positions on the houseboat. That was another idea he had. A third idea was to hire an airplane, and there would be Republican operatives in the airplane surveilling Democratic conversations in the Democratic campaign plane. Or if there were other nominees with their own planes, maybe plural Democratic planes from time to time. Why not hire an airplane, in other words, to keep track of what Democrats in their own planes might be saying while they were in flight? All these ideas were outlined to Mitchell and Dean. And at the end of this presentation, Mitchell basically said that all of this was too expensive. Keep in mind that both Dean and Mitchell were lawyers. All of this stuff is illegal. Why didn't they just throw Liddy out of the office? That's a pretty good question. What they did do, especially Mitchell, was tell Liddy, you've got to tone this down. We don't have enough money for all of that. And what was left from Project Gemstone was a cheaper series of ideas, most of them having to do with break-ins at potential Democratic nominees' headquarters, like Muskie and Humphrey and all who were vying for the nomination that year. And that way the Republicans can learn what the various potential nominees were thinking. That would be a cheaper kind of operation. And Mitchell told Liddy, we can probably provide you with a budget of maybe $200,000, $250,000. And it would come, of course, from campaign contributions to the committee to reelect the president. So Liddy now had permission to at least plan break-ins. And ultimately, after a bit of the planning process had been undertaken by him, it got to be later in the winter, early spring of 1972. And at that time, Liddy went down to Key Biscayne, the home of Bebe Rebozo, where Nixon liked to spend a lot of time. And there he met again with Mitchell and also Jeb Magruder, who was Mitchell's number 2 man at the committee to reelect the president. And sometime in the course of that meeting, apparently, Magruder may have suggested to Liddy that maybe the thing to do at this point is concentrate on Democratic National Committee headquarters, which happened to be at the Watergate Hotel. And now Liddy felt he had, if not specific instructions, at least a pretty good go-ahead to plan a break-in at the Watergate. That's April of 1972. And I think the most important decision that was made about that time, while Liddy began to plan for this break-in at the Watergate, was this decision to assign this man to the people around Liddy. That is the plumbers who are going to be thinking about the Watergate break-in. That is James McCord. James McCord was not a plumber. James McCord was head of security at the committee to reelect the president. And that is a crucial fact, because if James McCord were to be involved with the plumbers in a break-in like the one Liddy was now planning, and if he were to be captured by police, then the police would know that Creep would have to be involved in such a break-in, because McCord, of course, was a full-time employee of Creep, the committee to reelect the president. If it was just the plumbers caught, then Liddy and Hunt and people like them could just maybe claim it was a rogue operation. But if McCord were caught, that would be a direct tie to the committee to reelect the president. So this was a dangerous thing to have McCord involved with anything Liddy was planning. But Liddy wanted him there, so did the people around Mitchell. And so McCord now was associated with Liddy for what would become the break-in at the Watergate. And in fact, in May of 1972, a month before the break-in, McCord actually went up to Democratic National Headquarters, Larry O'Brien's office up at the DNC, and cased the joint, looked around to get a feel of where the offices were, posing as the uncle of somebody who worked there. And that's set the stage, of course, for the next event, episode number 4, the actual break-in at the Watergate. And here it is, the Watergate Hotel, one of the most prestigious addresses in all of Washington as of 1972. This thing had been built all the way back in 1965 and was very controversial at the time. You can see it doesn't look like a whole lot of other buildings in Washington. And in fact, one architectural critic happened to say that building the Watergate in Washington was like hiring a stripper to attend your grandmother's funeral. I'm not sure it's all that bad. And in fact, a lot of people took to it. It's within walking distance of a lot of important places in Washington. A lot of prestigious people were living there as of 1972. And the Democrats did have their campaign headquarters there, in addition to John Mitchell's residence. Mitchell lived at the Watergate along with other pretty important people. Today, you can stay at the Watergate. It's still a hotel and still a residence. And if you want to stay at the place that was Democratic National Headquarters in 1972, you can do that. It'll cost you $2,500 a night, but you're welcome to try to do that. It's open to you because of the events that were about to happen. It is now June of 1972, and Liddy, remember, felt he had this go-ahead from Mitchell and Magruder to break in at the Watergate. The way it was going to work was that Liddy and Hunt would be stationed at the Howard Johnson's, very close to the Watergate, act as supervisors there. There'd be some lookouts outside the Watergate to make sure the police didn't show up. And then McCord and four Cubans, as they were often called, would go into the Democratic National Committee headquarters and put taps on key members of the DNC's phones, especially Larry O'Brien, the head of the Democratic National Committee. There had been an earlier break-in, in fact, at the Watergate, presided over by Liddy. Those taps, however, didn't work, and Mitchell was very upset by that the taps didn't work. That was the first break-in a few weeks earlier. Mitchell didn't necessarily know about this second break-in, but Liddy felt he had to make the taps work to get in Mitchell's good graces again. So back to the Watergate he went. So it's him and Hunt at the Howard Johnson's, and McCord and the so-called four Cubans, all former employees of the CIA, going up to the DNC headquarters. I should say that they weren't all Cubans, those four. One of them was a guy named Frank Sturgis, who was not Cuban. He was actually somebody who, back in the 50s, had helped train Castro's guerrillas in Cuba to help take control of Cuba. And then he had a change of heart, and he worked for the CIA. And one of the things he tried to do was smuggle poison in with Castro's girlfriend's cosmetics as a way perhaps to poison Castro, a rather radical change of sides. And it was Sturgis up there, along with McCord, that night, breaking into the DNC headquarters and beginning to tap the phones. The way it went was that McCord and Hunt had left tape on the door of the basement, leading to the parking garage at the Watergate, so that they could get in and out very easily if they had to, and the door wouldn't lock behind them. And it happened that while they were up there, a security guard named Frank Wills noticed the tape on the door. And he didn't think anything of it at first because custodial personnel often would leave tape on the door. Maybe they just forgot to take it off. Wills took the tape off the door, went to get a bite to eat. And so it was that when McCord came downstairs, he noticed that the tape had been taken off the door. He then called Hunt and Liddy at the Howard Johnson's, and he said, look, somebody may know we're here. The tape is off the door. Maybe we should quit the operation. To his credit, Hunt agreed. Maybe the operation should be canceled right now. It's too risky. Somebody knows he might be there. Liddy overruled him, and ultimately McCord also thought, maybe it's not so bad. We should just go through with it. And so they did. The operation wasn't called off. McCord went back upstairs. Now, Wills, the security guard, came back, saw that McCord had put the tape back on the door, now knew that something was up. He did his job. He called the police. There's a burglary probably now at the Watergate. For this very competent act, Wills got a 40-cent a week raise by the people who employed him. And the police did show up at the Watergate. And this is the strangest twist of all. The police that showed up answering Will's call that there's a burglary going on happened to be policemen who were undercover. They were engaged in undercover drug operations. So they weren't dressed as policemen. They were dressed as what looked like hippies. And the lookout didn't know that they were policemen when they showed up. Nobody got the word up at the Democratic National Headquarters. And the policemen were able to surprise McCord and the four Cubans and arrest them for, of course, burglary. And shortly after the arrest, that's Saturday night, June 17th, shortly after the arrest, law enforcement officials searched the hotel room where the burglars had been staying. They found an address book with E. Howard Hunt's name in it, along with the letters WH for White House in the address book. They soon traced McCord to the committee to re-elect the president, and that meant that by Monday, June 19th, police were beginning to think they were really onto something here, as news broke in the paper that there'd been a break-in at the Watergate Hotel. It was that Monday, June 19th, apparently, that Liddy met with John Dean, who had been helping supervise the cash going from the committee to re-elect the president to members of the plumbers working with them. And Liddy told Dean, I know that you want me to be silent. Liddy hadn't been arrested yet. He soon would be. I promise you I'll be silent, but if you don't trust me not to talk, here's where I'll be, given time, given day. You can send somebody by, they can shoot me down. I'll understand if that's what you want to do. I'll cooperate. Dean told Liddy that wouldn't be necessary, but it was quite clear that to make sure nobody talked, those who had now been arrested, that hush money payments were going to have to come from the White House, at least at some point. And in the meantime, there was every incentive to find a way to make sure that this investigation that had already tied McCord to the committee to re-elect the president didn't go any further, and certainly didn't reach the plumbers unit that had been working out of the executive office building in the White House. So the stage was set for this meeting going on virtually here, June 23rd, 1972, 6 days after the break-in, 10 o'clock in the morning. H.R. Haldeman met with Nixon. Haldeman is the man on the left, and told Nixon that the FBI was looking into this Watergate affair because, after all, it did involve wiretaps. And Haldeman's idea was to make sure the FBI didn't look too further into it by having the CIA call the FBI off of this matter on the grounds that this was a matter of national security. And under the law, if that's what the CIA said, then the FBI wouldn't look into it any further. Nixon agreed to that, ultimately saying to Haldeman, they have to be paid, mentioning the burglars. They have to be paid. That's all there is to that. He said that a little later, but on June 23rd, he did authorize the CIA to call off the FBI. And that's why this conversation, the morning of June 23rd, is often called the smoking gun. That's Nixon obstructing justice, Nixon interrupting normal law enforcement, probably to make sure that nothing about this got back to the White House. Also that week, that first week of the Watergate affair, one of the strangest things that happened was this woman here, Martha Mitchell, wife of John Mitchell, called Helen Thomas of the UPI to talk about Martha Mitchell's concerns that her husband, John Mitchell, might be involved with some bad things regarding this campaign of 1972, and that she was trying to talk to this reporter, the famous Helen Thomas. All of a sudden, Helen Thomas could hear nothing but Mitchell shouting, "Don't do that, you get away, you get away." And then a dial tone, because the phone was ripped out of the wall, literally, by the man who was watching her, handling her, and making sure she didn't get into trouble. This man here, and that is Steve King. According to Mitchell's later account, she was sedated to make sure she didn't talk any further to a reporter that night. Steve King has always denied he helped sedate her, but apparently he did rip the phone out of the wall that night. This is Steve King, the way he looks nowadays. He would eventually be named by President Trump as our ambassador to the Czech Republic. So it is now the summer of 1972, and we have the cover-up well underway. Nobody's supposed to look into this. And as of that summer of 1972, Watergate was certainly a national story, but it didn't seem to be hurting Nixon that much. Nobody was going to look too much into this as far as law enforcement goes, not now. Nixon was riding high in the polls. The only thing that was going on in the summer and fall of 1972 was those famous reporters, Woodward and Bernstein from the Washington Post, were looking into this affair as carefully as they could and finding that quite a bit of campaign money from creep seemed to be going to some of these burglars at least, and also to fund other unsavory operations during the 1972 campaign. And the way they were getting that information was by the famous source Deep Throat. Here is the probable Deep Throat. That's Mark Felt, number 2 or 3 guy, I forget which, at the FBI. And he seemed to have been feeding Woodward and Bernstein this information all along. The only thing that bothered Nixon and Haldeman and those around him were what they now consider to be leaks, probably coming from the FBI, that were being funneled to Woodward and Bernstein. They didn't know who might be responsible for those leaks, but Haldeman thought it was probably Mark Felt all along at the FBI. And there was one conversation caught on tape where Nixon and Haldeman wondered what they could do about this. How could they stop what they consider to be the source of these leaks, Mark Felt, from talking to Woodward and Bernstein? And Haldeman said, well, maybe we could give Felt the top job ultimately at the FBI. So Nixon said maybe that's the way to shut him up. But then Haldeman happened to mention that he thought that Mark Felt was probably Jewish, to which Nixon responded, Christ, I'm not going to put another Jew in there, meaning the FBI. Mark Felt is certainly a Jewish name, Nixon said. Maybe that explains it. The leaks continued, but felt never got any higher at the FBI. And anyway, it didn't seem to matter much to public opinion. Nixon won re-election in November of 1972. He was inaugurated again in January 1973. He seemed to be riding high. The POWs were coming back from Vietnam. We had a treaty that meant the withdrawal of American troops. And in a conversation that Nixon had with Chuck Colson about that time, as he was sworn in for another term in 1972, Nixon seemed to think he could get away with anything now. He told Colson, look, the press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The establishment is the enemy. The professors are the enemy. Never forget that. Who knows what Nixon might have tried to do now that he seemed unassailable as a landslide victor in the 1972 campaign. The reason that he wasn't unassailable ultimately was the most important part of the whole affair. And that's episode 5, and I might say 5A, involving this man here, and that is John Sirica. John Sirica, Judge John Sirica, would be the judge in the Watergate trials, because ultimately the burglars who did not talk to authorities, did not reveal what they know, having been progressively paid off, as we now know, were going to go on trial. And the burglars in E. Howard Hunt, they were going to plead guilty, but there was going to be an actual trial for G. Gordon Liddy and James McCord. They were going to go on trial. Now, Sirica was nobody's fool. And all through the events leading up to the trial and during the trial, he could tell that people were not telling all they knew. He knew that people were being silent when they could reveal the full story behind this break-in. And he knew there was more to this story than anybody was letting on. And he was very frustrated, for example, during Liddy's and McCord's trial, when, for example, the treasurer of CREEP would take the stand, Hugh Sloan, and Sirica would actually turn to Sloan and he would say, where did this $200,000 come from that seemed to be funding this break-in? And Sloan would say, I don't know. Well, what's the story here? Jeb Magruder took the stand, said barely anything helpful. Why was there so much silence? And that's why Sirica told these burglars, you're going to be given the fullest sentence I can possibly give you. Liddy was looking at 20 years, and so was McCord for that matter. And it was those hefty sentences that a very frustrated Sirica was threatening against these defendants that would eventually cause John Dean some very sleepless nights. There was a guilty verdict against McCord and Liddy. Sentencing for everybody was going to be March 23rd. Naturally, they wanted more money because they were now looking, the burglars were, at a very hefty sentence indeed. Not necessarily Liddy, who always thought of himself as a good soldier, but certainly Hunt and the burglars, the 4 Cubans. And McCord was going to go to jail as well. So John Dean, on March 21st, had a famous conversation with Nixon and others around Nixon, where he told Nixon that it was going to take more money to maintain Hunt's silence and the silence of the so-called 4 Cubans. Dean had talked to them and he knew this. Nixon said, how much more money is it going to take to make sure they don't talk? Dean said, it may take $1 million. And to Dean's surprise, Nixon said, we can get that. We can get that. And that was the conversation on March 21st, where Dean told Nixon there's a cancer growing on the presidency. And Nixon once more obstructed justice by instructing Dean to get that money, continue to buy the silence, even if that meant having to go speak to John Mitchell, who by now was out of government and still living at the Watergate. That's 2 days before the 23rd. And on the 23rd, once Dean knew that more money was going to be funneled to many of these defendants, on March 23rd, James McCord decided he was fed up. Why should he go to jail when people like Jeb Magruder lied on the stand and weren't going to go to jail at all? McCord didn't think he was a bad person. McCord felt that he was obeying orders, thought that probably people like Mitchell had a good reason for ordering this. Why should McCord, who had served his country in the CIA, why should McCord be in a filthy, bug-ridden cell in DC while these other people went free? He didn't think that was fair. And that's why McCord wrote a famous letter to Sirica. And in that letter, McCord said, I have reason to think that people at the White House perhaps are buying the silence of fellow defendants. I have reason to think that people are maintaining silence because somebody is essentially buying that silence. They know more than they're letting on, thus confirming Sirica's suspicions. And on March 23rd, even as Liddy was getting his 20-year sentence, Sirica read that letter in open court that James McCord was alleging a cover-up. Perhaps hush money was being paid. And that is what broke the entire thing open. Because now, apparently, we had good evidence that this wasn't just a break-in tied to creep, that somebody at the White House might be engaged in illegal activity, that is, engineering a cover-up. By now, it's the spring of 1973, and in short order, it wasn't just Sirica looking into this, it was also a Senate committee led by Senator Ervin of North Carolina. It was also a special prosecutor, this man here, Archibald Cox. And the leading thing in everybody's mind is now the cover-up. Was there a cover-up, and was the White House involved? And the reason that was going to be a difficult thing to put back under the carpet was John Dean made a decision that the time had come to come clean and to tell the grand jury in this case in Washington, D.C., just what he knew. And it was John Dean that began to tell the story of the cover-up following his departure from the White House in April of 1973. And it was now not just a national story, it was the national story. John Dean and McCord were now talking about a cover-up. Nixon, of course, and those around him were denying it. At this point, only about 25% of the American people thought that Nixon should be impeached. After all, at this point, it's Nixon's word against Dean, Nixon's word against McCord. If you're going to believe anybody, why wouldn't it be the president? And it may well be, if this was all there was, this huge national story, if this was all there was to it, maybe Nixon would weather the storm because there was no way to prove that Nixon knew about the cover-up or had ordered anything to do with it, at least as of the spring of 1973. What changed that, of course, was episode number 6, the summer of 1973, as the nation was watching the Watergate hearings led by Senator Ervin with great attention. Behind the scenes, Ervin committee members, that is, lawyers working for them, staff members working for them, had begun to wonder if maybe there was a taping system at the White House. And the reason they wondered that was John Dean has speculated that there might be, and they kept getting these responses to their questions that seemed really detailed in nature, as if somebody might have been copying from some transcripts, maybe of a tape. Well, they didn't know. So they called this man to testify, of course, Alexander Butterfield, who by now was head of the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, big responsible job. And they brought him to a little room at the executive office building behind the scenes, not on TV. And they interviewed him about what he knew about operations at the White House, because after all, he'd been there under Haldeman for a couple of years. Butterfield had told his wife, I don't think they'll ask me about this taping system. I'm not going to volunteer anything if they don't ask me about it. But as it turned out, they did ask him about it. Butterfield famously said, I was afraid you fellows would ask that. And it was at this point that he revealed to committee members that there was a taping system at the White House. And once that happened, very excited committee members went to Ervin, and the senators told them what they just found out. Butterfield was brought back on national TV to say the same thing. And now we knew there was a taping system at the White House, which meant we now had a way to tell who's telling the truth. Was it Dean or was it Nixon? John Dean breathed a sigh of relief because now he felt there was a way for people to know that he was actually truthful about this cover-up. The only question now was, would Nixon have to surrender those tapes? Everything about Watergate now came down to that question. As of the middle of the summer of 1973, would Nixon have to surrender the tapes? And for over a year, that was the great question. And the more Nixon refused to do so, the less public opinion was in his favor, especially after the famous events, as you see here, of October 1973, when he fired both Archibald Cox, he actually wanted to fire Archibald Cox, but what happened was he ordered his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Cox. When Richardson, an outstanding Massachusetts public servant, wouldn't do it, Richardson resigned rather than do it, leading to Richardson's second in command, William Ruckelshaus, also ordered by Alexander Haig to fire Cox. Ruckelshaus refused to do it. Ruckelshaus was fired, leaving Robert Bork, number 3, finally to fire Archibald Cox, all of which Cox, being an outstanding public servant himself, made Nixon look terrible and led ultimately to a growing public opinion that maybe the time had come for him to leave. Maybe he did know about this cover-up, perhaps even from the beginning. In what spelled the end, what spelled doom for Nixon, of course, were the events of July 1974, when the Supreme Court finally ordered Nixon to surrender the tapes in response to the subpoena from the committee in the Senate and also from the new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski. Knowing now that he couldn't obscure the evidence of this cover-up any longer, it was right there on the tapes. March 23rd and June 23rd especially, Nixon did surrender the tapes, and shortly after that, he resigned as president of the United States. And that was, for our purposes at least, the main events that helped, I think, to shape the tale of Watergate. And since we are now at the agreed upon ending mark, looks like it's about 10 before 8, I thought that would be a good place to conclude. And just in case you have any comments and questions, I'd be glad to help respond to them.
Great. So thanks so much, Dan. Wonderful job as expected. Folks, as Dan said, if you have any comments or questions, please get them into the chat and Q&A now, and I will fire away.
Okay.
Dan, let me ask the first question. Putting together this presentation, doing all that research, reading some of the Watergate books, what was the thing that most surprised you?
The thing that most surprised me about all of this? Let's see. What surprised me the most? I think probably the thing that surprised me most was the personality of McCord in the role he played in all of this. I knew about the letter he wrote, but the considerations behind it and his sense of himself as somebody who didn't deserve this fate that was now coming his way. Very likely an extremely long sentence from Judge Sirica. I don't think I ever appreciated how important McCord's personality was, and the fateful fact that he was assigned to creep in the first place, which should never have happened. If he hadn't been assigned to creep, then I bet the cover-up would have succeeded. Nobody would have talked about this, and Nixon could have served until the beginning of '77.
You know, when you come up with those acronyms, you got to be careful what they spell out, right?
That's right.
So an anonymous attendee asks, were the tapes ever made public? Can Nixon be heard talking about the break-in?
Yes. If you want to listen to the tapes, you can. I think there's a form you have to fill out, but they're available to the public. And Nixon can be heard talking about the break-in in the immediate aftermath. When he heard about the break-in, he famously threw an ashtray across the room. There's no reason to think he knew about the break-in right before it happened, but he certainly was very upset when he heard that it happened. Of course, he knew about the plumber's unit and knew of some of the people involved. And you can hear his reaction about a lot of this if you just go through the National Archives and you go through the right process. It's perfectly available.
So here are some comments, actually. Pat says, 25-ish years after the break-in, Monica Lewinsky actually lived at the Watergate.
Yeah, that's true. She lived at the Watergate. And it's still a very expensive address. And people still live there. I'm not sure how they afford it, but they still do.
Diane says, thank you. This was excellent. Nancy says, very interesting. I lived through it and listened on the radio to every bit that I could. Deanne says, great presentation. MD says, I loved this presentation. You're so passionate about this subject. A lot of interesting facts I never knew. Thank you. Katrina asks, how does L. Patrick Gray fit into this?
L. Patrick Gray was the head of the FBI. My understanding is he wasn't very well regarded by a lot of career bureaucrats who were in law enforcement in Washington, but he was head of the FBI. The way he fits into it is that, as I recall, he had possession of evidence about the money that was going to creep and the source of a lot of that money that he eventually caused to be, I believe, destroyed. Now, I don't want to slander L. Patrick Gray unnecessarily, but whether it was done by negligence or intentionally, my understanding was that he played some role in making sure that the wrong people didn't see certain evidence. He might have claimed to have done that accidentally, but he was supposed to be a loyalist to the people around Nixon, and they kept him around after J. Edgar Hoover left because they thought that maybe he was somebody that they could trust. And they certainly didn't want anybody that they couldn't trust as head of the FBI. They certainly didn't want, if they could avoid it, somebody like Felt there. But I think that's how Gray fits into it. I think he did have access to evidence, maybe evidence that John Dean had left him with that eventually wasn't available, that something happened to it. But I should have a better answer than that, but that's the best of my recollection.
Sure. Next question. Didn't Lyndon Johnson catch Richard Nixon on tape trying to derail the talks with the North Vietnam?
I know that Lyndon Johnson had good reason to think that Nixon had done that. Now, whether he was caught on tape saying that this was something Nixon was going to do, or whether Johnson had other sources, there is some evidence that Johnson had intelligence that Nixon and the people around him had talked to Anna Chennault about talking to President Tu over in Saigon. He chose not to make anything of it, maybe partly because he didn't think he could prove it, partly because he thought that might be pretty bad for the Republic to know that a leading presidential candidate was involved in those machinations. But there is evidence that Johnson did know something about this, had what he considered pretty good evidence of this. But at the height of the campaign, as Humphrey and Nixon were virtually even in the polls, chose not to disclose it when he might have. I just don't know the media of that, whether it was a taping element or something else.
Sally says this was fascinating. I had forgotten so many of the details. This was a wonderful program. Thank you. And Jolie, I apologize for any mispronunciations, by the way. And Jolie says, great presentation. Kathleen says you did an awesome job. This was very informative. All right, let's get some hard-hitting questions here.
Hard-hitting questions.
Yeah, so Lisa says, Liddy spoke at my college graduation. How did he escape jail time?
Oh, well, he did go to jail, but I like that question because it gives me a chance to say what happened to him. He did go to jail, and he thought that was going to be 20 years. Maybe he'd be paroled before 20 years. I mean, but think about that sentence. You can see that Sirica meant business. That this is a break-in at Democratic National Headquarters. You get 20 years for that? That's kind of a big deal. What happened was, after serving some years of his sentence, a couple of years, he was pardoned by Jimmy Carter. And the reason Carter pardoned him was Carter, I think understandably, thought it was unfair that a lot of the people, the higher ups, people like Nixon, didn't go to jail over Watergate, but Liddy did. There was something unfair about that, especially based upon the nature of the crime. 20 years seemed pretty hefty. And so Liddy was pardoned, and he left after serving only a fraction of his sentence.
And let's talk about the sentences. Diane asks, what sentence did McCord get?
McCord got a lighter sentence. I don't remember what it was. I know Garrett Graff probably talks about that in the book towards the end, but it wasn't 20 years. It was appreciably less than that, as I recall. And I'm not sure how much of it he served. A bunch of people at Watergate did go to jail. Usually the sentences were in the single digits, and they just served a year or two, or maybe a bit more than that. The most important of all the prisoners was Chuck Colson. Colson was involved in the cover-up, and also a lot of stuff at the White House, for that matter, that were pretty unsavory. And he did go to jail. What happened to him in jail, famously, was that he converted to Christianity, became a very sincere crusader to make conditions better for people in prisons. And among other things, he became a real apostle for prison education once he got out of prison. So he devoted his life to something that was actually valuable following this experience. Today, there's all sorts of commentary, articles, and people working for the cause of prison education. And part of it has to do with Colson and what he took out of that experience when he went to jail.
Lee says, thank you, great presentation. Folks, as we start to wind down, I still have a few more questions, but as we start to wind down, let Dan know in the chat if you enjoyed tonight's presentation, if you haven't typed a comment already. An anonymous attendee says, great presentation, and this sort of goes along with your last two questions. In the end, weren't even the convictions, or at least the time served, rather lenient?
Yeah. Sometimes the sentences were a bit more, like 5-6 years or something, but for good behavior, they all got out before they normally would have. So usually it was something like a year or two that people like Ehrlichman and Colson would have been served. Colson a bit more, but that they would be serving in prison. Yeah, not very much.
I think Ronald made a comment that Liddy actually appeared on some episodes of Miami Vice after all of this.
Yeah, Liddy had quite a career, famous nationwide radio personality, did quite well for himself following all this. Always viewed himself as the good soldier. That was his self-image.
I feel like a few years ago, I would see him even on infomercials. So yes.
I think he was on some reality TV shows too.
There you go. An anonymous attendee asks, during Watergate, were Americans more accepting of the truth than they are today?
More accepting of the truth? I think during Watergate, people cared more about the truth. I think people of all stripes really wanted to know if the president and trusted personnel around the president were actually lying to them and indeed engaged in a cover-up. And there was, I think, more of a willingness back then to actually trust the evidence and not to assume that people on the other side of Nixon were just making stuff up. I think the big difference between today and then was that then I think the truth actually mattered to more people. And I don't think it matters as much to present day Americans.
Ronald says, you showed a picture of episode 7 with Spiro Agnew.
Yeah.
Would you address the importance of this?
Yeah, so Agnew resigned in disgrace from the vice presidency because he'd been accepting kickbacks back when he was governor of Maryland. That was the beginning of the eventful month of October, which turned out terribly for Nixon. Not only was he now tarred by the disgrace of Spiro Agnew, his vice president, but he also, of course, was involved with what amounted to the firing of Richardson and Ruckelshaus when they refused to interfere with the special prosecutor's duty. That's what really turned the tables for Nixon. He was really preoccupied with all this. And in the middle of it all, of course, was the Yom Kippur War, one of the most important events of October 1973. And Nixon was so more or less out of it that at the height of that war, when the Israelis were surrounding the Egyptian Third Army in the Sinai, and the Soviets were making their famous threat to intervene, so really scary few days in October of 1973, Kissinger more or less shut Nixon out of the decision-making and orchestrated our response to that rather than having Nixon do it himself. So those were dangerous times when Nixon was so preoccupied with a mess of his own making.
Linda says, a lot of what you discussed tonight was in a show called Gaslight. Have you seen that show, and did you think it was accurate? Haven't seen it?
No, I keep wanting to see Gaslight. I haven't seen it, but that probably does a much better job of talking about Martha Mitchell than I did. You might notice that sometimes I slip up and I say Margaret Mitchell, and it's because I'm from Atlanta. Sometimes I can't help it.
So we're winding down here. Huck says, please come back again. Lisa says, you provided us with so much information. Can't help but see history repeating itself years later. Jean says, so informative and interesting. Can hear the passion you have for this topic. Let's see. Debbie says, great job. I used to know much of this. Good to get reminded of it. Thank you. Katrina says, thanks for a wonderful presentation. James says, very good. Thank you very much. James asks, are any of the plumbers still alive today?
Oh, let's see. Offhand, I can't think of any that are still alive. I wouldn't be surprised if they were. They'd be in their 80s probably, or early 90s. But that's a good question. I actually don't know.
Nancy says that G. Gordon Liddy was recently on the new Perry Mason show. Carmen says this was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. Debbie notes that she was surprised Peter Rodino wasn't discussed more. Any comments on Peter?
So I would have done that if I got to end at 8:15. Rodino was really, really important because he was the head of the House Judiciary Committee that undertook impeachment hearings in regard to Nixon in 1974. The reason Rodino was in that slot was because the old head of the House Judiciary Committee, Manny Seller, I think he had retired at the time. He was rather elderly, had been in Congress for about 40 years or something. And Seller might have been much more sympathetic to Nixon than Peter Rodino. The fact that Rodino was the chair made a difference. And they were really bulldog interrogators, as a matter of fact, during the impeachment hearings. But Rodino, a man of principle, was in the right place at the right time. That's right.
Debbie says John Dean is often on TV now. Sarah or
Yes.
Ciara, again, apologize for any mispronunciations. Ciara says, great presentation. I recommend the book Most Dangerous by Steve Shinikin. It's about Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. It also has information about the Watergate scandal.
Good idea.
I am 12 years old and I love that book. Oh, 12.
Wow.
Thank you
Good
for
for you.
staying up till 8 o'clock and watching us. That's
Very
excellent.
impressive. Keep it up.
So Daniel, let me ask you the last question. What's next for Daniel Breen? Do you have any presentations coming up?
Well, yeah, thank you for asking. It's really good to see so many of you. It's such a great crowd from all the patrons of these area libraries. I really appreciate you joining us this evening. Just in case you'd like to come to another presentation, I'm from Somerville, that's where I live, and I'm going to be talking about the 3 Massachusetts engineers of the disaster of the early days of the War of 1812. So these 3 Massachusetts people just about lost the war for us in the first few months of the conflict, and I'm going to talk about them. So if you're interested in the War of 1812, very different than Watergate, come by the Somerville Museum, and that's November 6th, which I think is a Sunday at 2 p.m. Somerville Museum.
Great. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for presenting to us tonight. Thank you to the Friends of the Tewksbury Library for sponsoring and the 9 other libraries who helped promote. Folks, look for those who are watching live, look for an email from me tomorrow with a feedback survey, a recording, and information about some other upcoming virtual U.S. history programs in November and December. So thank you all so much. Dan, thank you in particular, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
Good evening. Bye.